Alors, l'heure est au mot de bienvenue. This is the time for all the welcoming addresses. My name is Marie-Josée Hamel, and I'm the director of the CERBAL. The CERBAL is the research center of OLBI, the Official Languages and Bilingualism Institute of the University of Ottawa. And this is my colleague, Sylvie Lamoureux, who's also the conference co-chair. And she's kindly replaced me during my 6-month sabbatical last term. So that's why for the first July to December, you were dealing with Sylvie, and who took charge of all the call for papers and abstract evaluation, also dealt with our new OCS system for the as a host for the conference site.
So we're quite pleased that over 100 people have registered for the conference, so you'll see them trickling in over the morning. And it's already our 6th edition of the CERBAL conference. So I don't know if how many of you, like me, have been here since the very first, which was in June 2008, when I was a new hire here. So it's interesting to see how it evolved and the changes that have come. So I'd like to also offer greetings, not only to the people who are in the room, but everyone who's following us on YouTube, the members of our local, national, and international networks. So welcome to all of you, et merci à tous de votre collaboration et de votre patience avec notre nouveau système au début de l'année, and it's nice to put faces to the names today.
Yes, indeed. So the last time we met, that was in 2012, and our theme at the time was innovative practices in computer-assisted language learning. And I reminded you that users of technology in second language learning and teaching are risk takers, they are multitaskers, they are problem solvers, and they are doers of plans B and C. And you know what? I could repeat just the same this year when describing literacies and autonomy of the advanced language learners. So being on a bilingual campus, city, and country, being Anglophone, Francophones, Allophones, natives, immigrants, this theme resonates with many of us in our research and our practice as second language teachers, trainers, as well as lifelong language learners, as you can hear me when I speak English. So the challenges are great, and so are the rewards when attaining a high level of competency in a second or a foreign language. And hence, let's together focus on this theme over the next 2 days. Let's think, pair, and share, like I like to say, our thoughts, ideas, and experience. 2 artefacts vous seront utiles durant le colloque. Le premier étant le programme. Je le montre aux gens qui sont en ligne. Alors, ce programme, il offre une description détaillée des 2 conférences plénières de Mesdames Heidi Byrnes, that I would like you to identify, so you will see her very soon, et Madame Nicole Poteau, des 2 tables rondes organisées par mes collègues Sheila Scott et Huguette Bourgeois. Pouvez-vous vous identifier? Voilà, Sheila et Huguette. Monica Gézac, que nous allons voir plus tard, et le symposium de ma chaire de recherche avec pour invité Nicolas Guichon, le voilà, Jérémy Serrard et Chantal Dion qui va se joindre à nous plus tard. Enfin aussi une 30aine de présentations individuelles sous forme de communication orale, sous forme d'ateliers et d'affiches. Alors merci aux collègues canadiens et d'ailleurs d'être là avec nous pour partager le fruit de vos recherches et de vos pratiques. Il y aura aussi un horaire. Donc, l'horaire est un objet à part, un artefact à part, avec des indications précieuses sur l'heure, la salle et la langue utilisée durant la présentation. Donc, vous allez voir, vous avez des petites icônes qui vous indiquent la langue de la présentation et vous aurez des étudiants qui vous feront part de la langue utilisée durant la période de questions. Plusieurs personnes qui m'entourent sont ici pour vous aider. Un comité exécutif très efficace, des techniciens et une demi-douzaine d'étudiants volontaires. La majorité d'entre eux, tout comme moi, portent un superbe chandail bleu couleur bleu schtroumpf. Alors, vous ne pouvez pas les manquer, n'hésitez pas à les solliciter. Les étudiants vont notamment assurer la présidence des sessions parallèles. S'il vous plaît, présentateurs, présentatrices, regardez-les et respectez les consignes de temps. 30, 10, 5. 30 minutes pour discuter, 10 minutes de période de questions et 5 minutes pour assurer un battement entre les activités. Merci par avance. Grâce au système d'interprétation Whisper et 2 étudiants en interprétation chevronnée, alors vous en avez un là, Anton Emmanuel et Pascal qui est derrière, les présentations qui se déroulent dans cet auditorium vont être traduites vers l'anglais. Et donc, on vous invite à utiliser des écouteurs qui vont vous permettre d'entendre vers cette langue les présentations qui se produisent dans cette salle. N'oubliez pas de rendre les écouteurs à la sortie. C'est un système qui est coûteux, précieux. Donc, vous empruntez et vous remettez. Je termine en vous invitant à réagir, à poser des questions, à partager vos impressions sur Twitter. Donc, on est #Serbal2014 durant le colloque. Et je cède maintenant la place et la parole à M. Richard Clément, directeur de l'ILOB et doyen associé de la Faculté des arts de l'Université d'Ottawa. Merci beaucoup et bon colloque à tous.
Alors, merci Marie-Josée. Pardon. Alors, distingués invités, chers collègues, au nom de l'Université d'Ottawa, de la Faculté des arts et de l'Institut, je vous souhaite donc la bienvenue à cette 6e, effectivement, édition de la conférence du Cerbal. Welcome to all. Comme vous le savez sans doute, l'ILOB a été créé en 2007 dans la continuité de ce qui avait été l'Institut des langues secondes. En plus des missions d'enseignement de l'anglais et du français, ainsi que de l'évaluation des compétences propres à l'ancien institut, l'ILOB s'est vu alors confier le mandat de devenir le promoteur et le diffuseur des connaissances canadiennes en matière d'enseignement et d'apprentissage des langues, de bilinguisme individuel et collectif et d'aménagement linguistique. C'est un mandat de taille, vous comprendrez, et cette conférence-ci s'inscrit justement dans la foulée de ce mandat-là. C'est probablement une de nos activités principales, et je vais y revenir. To that end, we have developed through the years relationships East and West with European partners, notably the European Centre for Modern Languages and the European Commission, as well as with numerous Asian and Middle East partners, North-South, through the Inter-American Organization for Higher Education, for which we are currently establishing a language training network, as well as our involvement in a project to foster bilingualism in Sri Lanka, no less. And of course, all the while maintaining contact and involving our Canadian partners, be they research centers or professional associations. At the University of Ottawa, a recent research achievement has been the creation, under our instigation, of 4 research chairs on bilingualism. Marie-Josée Hamel is our first incumbent. Le colloque du Cerbal s'inscrit bien, comme je le disais, dans la foulée de notre mandat. C'est certainement l'événement qui sollicite le plus d'énergie chez nous. Le thème de cette année est particulièrement porteur parce qu'il touche à des phénomènes qui nous sont certes familiers dans ce contexte-ci, mais aussi complexes et fragiles en raison de leurs multiples déterminants et multiples obstacles aussi. Alors que je parcourais le programme, il me semble néanmoins que la problématique qui sera illustrée au cours des prochains jours tourne autour de la mesure dans laquelle des compétences linguistiques avancées satisfont les besoins psychologiques, et vous voyez ma propre formation ici, des besoins psychologiques fondamentaux, c'est-à-dire les besoins de compétences, les besoins d'autonomie et les besoins d'appartenance. J'espère pouvoir vous en reparler tout au cours de ces 2 jours. J'aimerais finalement remercier nos multiples partenaires, dont certains représentants sont ici avec nous. Vous verrez leur liste à l'endos du programme. I would like also to thank Marie-Josée Hamel and her team for all their work during making this possible, and wish you as well as to our colleagues following us at a distance, a very fruitful scientific and networking conference. Now, finally, I would like to invite Jessica Chang, President of the Association of Students in the Second Language Teaching Program, to introduce our first speaker. Jessica.
Hold it. As a student who has spent the past 4 years specializing in second language teaching, it's an absolute honor to introduce our first guest speaker today, whose works have greatly influenced my lesson planning and teaching philosophy. Originally from Germany, this speaker completed her bachelor's, master's, and PhD in the United States and is currently a professor at Georgetown University. Her background in German, modern languages, and linguistics has allowed her to expound upon a large range of issues related to second language teaching and learning, with a focus on the development of advanced literacy levels in a second language. This focus on advanced literacy levels allowed her to be a key member in the creation of a 4-year content-oriented and task-based curriculum that has gained national and international recognition since its development from 1997 to 2000. In addition, her research on reading and writing, curriculum and materials development, assessment of L2 abilities, and much more has been published in various journals such as the Modern Language Journal, Language Testing, Language Teaching, International Journal of Applied Linguistics, the German Quarterly, as well as some German journals that I'm too afraid to pronounce. Her research and background has led to her teaching various courses and workshops within the United States, as well as internationally, and she has presented at many professional conferences and symposiums as a keynote speaker. So now, without further ado, I would like to present our first plenary speaker, Ms. Heidi Byrnes.
I'm going to clip this on here. Or just stick it right there. Perfect. Somewhere. Okay, we're good. And then, is this good enough if I have it right here? Oh, yeah. Sure. Good. Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for the warm welcome. And I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference, in particular Marie-Josée and her co-worker, that now I understand why different correspondences were taking place with Sylvie. And thank you to all of you for coming here, because even in the brief conversations this morning that I had over coffee, I realized that people come from quite a distance to this conference. I have to apologize first for doing this in English. I said on the walk over, my French is from way back when in Germany, and this would be a good place to be and get from reasonably good listening comprehension in applied linguistics to productive speaking, but I'm afraid to subject you to this kind of behavior on my part now. So please forgive me for doing this in English. The topic that I have chosen, obviously, is the larger topic of the advanced learner. But since the advanced learner is most certainly a very complex person, there are many ways in which one can talk about advanced learning. In a plenary talk like this, there is an additional problem with it. On some level, plenary talks are, I suppose, to be reinforcing of things that you already know, which I am quite certain is the case with this audience. I am surely not telling you too many new things. By the same token, I do believe that plenary talks are also intended to extend things a little bit. So I will try to do both, presumably reinforcing things that you already know, and perhaps adding a few perspectives here and there that might not be as well known and perhaps can lead to what I hope will also be possible at the end of this presentation, some back and forth in the audience, some questions, some comments, some complaints about what has just been said. So, let us begin. Some preliminary thoughts about how one might describe advancedness. And as I was getting ready for this talk, I thought, what am I telling these people anything about advancedness? They already know it. But on some level, the very decision to link advancedness with bilingualism and multilingualism is actually a relatively new development in applied linguistics. We did not necessarily link it to bilingualism and multilingualism, so that in and of itself is a reshaping of the construct of advancedness that at this point of the discussion in the field, it seems to be the case that one really cannot sufficiently well talk about advancedness in a second language unless one links it to all sorts of constructs in multilingualism, bilingualism, whichever way you want to go. And as I was reflecting on this further, I couldn't help but being a little bit contrarian, so to speak. So I thought, okay, multilingualism, here we come from Germany, and we would say, I am talking to you about something that you already know, which in German you would say is Eulen nach Athen tragen. Now you think, okay, what's that? And here we are. This is an Eule, an owl. And this owl, as you can see, is being carried to Athens. And you say, okay, why is the owl being carried to Athens, and what does any of that mean? And you can see here is Athena, and if you look at her very carefully, she actually has on her helmet, this is the typical depiction in art of Athena, she has an owl, and actually my choice of the owl was exactly that one, because there's a significant resemblance between this barn owl and the helmet depiction of the owl. And then you see this owl one more time on the back of the drachma. This was the coin, of course, in Hellenistic times, where throughout the entire region of the Eastern Mediterranean, all the way going to India, this was the coin in the realm. So what does carrying owls to Athens mean? Athens, of course, was the commercial center. The back of the coin had an owl because the owl had been associated with Athena, because there were lots and lots and lots of owls roosting in the Parthenon. Just like in many other buildings, you have pigeons forever roosting everywhere. So the expression came to be, let's not carry owls to Athens. Let's not take wealth back into this wealthy city, where this expression, this phrase in German, of course, then means don't do something that is completely superfluous, which is sort of where I'm beginning to worry. Am I doing something that is completely superfluous? Am I carrying owls to Athens, where everybody already knows all of this? Now, if you don't like my owls being carried to Athens, let's try them in English. And what might that be? We might be taking coals to Newcastle, right? And you say, okay, coals to Newcastle. Here we are. I found this nice pile of coals, and here they are. And Newcastle on Tyne, I found this very nice 16th century depiction of the city, was one of the major centers in England for the mining of coal. And you see, here's a very nice shipping area. This same meaning one more time. It would make absolutely no sense whatsoever to take coals to Newcastle. They've got plenty themselves already, right? So one more time, the meaning being, this is a useless, superfluous enterprise. Now, to you, what would this look like if we did it in French? Thoughts? Well, I went to my trusting phraseology book. And the trusting phraseology book sometimes gets it right and sometimes gets it wrong. So we shall see. You can throw things at me. And the first thing I found was this. I thought, I like this. Okay. And then I thought, let's put some pretty pictures next to this. And here we have them, dancing at the Moulin Rouge. Or we could actually be even better than that. We could have our déjeuner sur l'herbe. Or we could even do that. Or if this gets too risque, the phrase book had another suggestion, and it said this. And we could do that, and it would be a little bit less provocative, and going to some cartoons, it might look like this, where we don't know which way we need to go. It could look like this. And finally, it could be the school teacher that said, please come in. My door is open, and now we're not going to do something superfluous. We're going to do something real, right? And let's hope we can do that. Okay. Advancedness in bilingualism and multilingualism now being very closely connected in applied linguistics. And another linkage that did not used to be made in the past, but it is now very strongly made, is linking advancedness with literacy, or again, the multipleness of it coming to the foreground with multiliteracy, where the assumption is, and this is a rather significant shift here, that the kinds of language abilities that we want to foster with advancedness are very strongly linked to phenomena of literacy. And what's interesting about that new linkage is that that seems to be true both for oral language and for literate language. So it's one more time a rethinking of the construct of advancedness. And the one I want to add on today, very deliberately, one that I don't see enough yet, but that I would like to put forward as one that is particularly rich in ways of thinking about advancedness, would be the whole notion of meaning making. Now you could say, what else is new, speaking of taking owls to Athens or coals to Newcastle? What have we been doing all along? If it wasn't that the entire enterprise is about meaning making, and I would certainly agree with you. By the same token, I don't think we have sufficiently theorized that. And so this is sort of where I want to take my time with you this morning and go a little bit beyond the entertainment value of an opening talk. What do I mean here? What I want to put into the center of the discussion is the whole notion of choice. Meaning making as being about choices being made. That's a significant shift, and I hope I can persuade you to agree with that kind of a statement. Choices are being made for meaning making and toward meaning making. There's a certain process approach to this, and we can think of it in several ways. We can, of course, begin to think of it, choice, as centrally focused on the learner, in which case we would foreground learner agency. We would then say, although this has been the case all along, with the advanced learner, perhaps a particularly interesting way of looking at advanced performance and at the advanced learner as a person would be in terms of choices being made, deliberate choices being made. The second one I would emphasize would be that these choices are situated. They are situated in contexts, and they're motivated by contexts. So learner agency situated in context would be another way of describing the advanced learner. The third one would be, and this is a little unusual perhaps, choices being made and conceptualized as we look at them as the path chosen as distinct from the path not chosen. We don't normally think of it that way, but I would like to spend a little bit of time doing that because I think it sheds light on a good number of things. And finally, I want to pitch choice as an investment of the self. And so taking those four things, we will look at them at a little bit more detail. So, choice as learner agency. What do I mean by that? If you look at the second language teaching and learning literature, you are completely familiar with the use, the trope of learner agency. But I would like to rethink that one a little bit here in conjunction with the advanced learner. We think of learner agency typically in terms of an individual learner internal set of abilities, skills, so to speak. And obviously, in communicative language teaching in particular, there's a lot to be said for taking that kind of an approach in order to encourage the learner to feel that she, he, can in fact even do this. And in the American context, given the very fragile position of foreign language teaching in contrast with a Canadian setting where I think this is much more embedded in the cultural environment, the pitch towards individual agency is actually an almost necessary one in order to be persuasive about the entire enterprise. Since, of course, by American ideology, the individual rules anyway, so you have sort of a progressivist stance here that foregrounds individual agency. And we then pitch very strongly in communicative language teaching conveying your own meaning, if we're going to bring in meaning here. So in other words, you are the person that can say what he or she wishes to say. That makes a lot of sense again. In communicative language teaching, and as you will note to some extent, I am contrasting the goals and the approaches of communicative language teaching to more advanced language teaching, and we may wish to discuss that. And finally, again, this is very American, but I think is dominant in many other places of the world by now, also because of the Anglophone dominance of much of what goes on in applied linguistic thinking, is the notion of personal creativity. You are the originator of creative thinking, so to speak, and therefore are the agent of meaning making. I don't think that's enough. So my next tableau here is, in fact, one to attenuate the purely individualistic notion of what goes on when we're talking about advancedness. And I will do that by saying, let's look at context so that individual agency will now be reframed in terms of action in social context. Again, of course, this is always true in any communication, but typically in the more beginning levels of language teaching and learning, we don't foreground that. And it may be for good pedagogical reason that we don't foreground it. But since we are talking about more advanced learners, at the very least now, preferably earlier, but certainly now, we must foreground the fact that all of this takes place in a social context. That this context itself does not exist in and of itself, but is socially constructed, that it is not place in and of itself, that it is not time in and of itself, that it is not actors in themselves, but all of this is socially and culturally constructed. To some extent, that was the fallacy that occurred with some of the communicative language teaching, where you just took places and times and said, okay, communicate, would you? Rather than thinking of this entire context in and of itself already being socially constructed. We would then say that at the advanced level, we think of all of this as a linkage between oral and written texts to contexts, and then imagining the context on the basis of the oral and the written text. Let me restate it slightly, since I am, of course, talking primarily about instructed settings. Talking about immersive settings would be a totally different affair still. But what we're asking our learners to do, and in an FL environment, this is an extraordinarily complex affair, to enable them to link the oral and the written texts that you use for instruction and to imagine the social contexts that must be true in order for the texts to say what they say and to be constructed like that. And in reverse, to imagine the contexts and then come up with the oral and written texts that would fit the imagined context. This is, as I say, intellectually, aesthetically, emotionally value-laden work that is extraordinarily difficult to do. But what is now showing up in the literature, and I think quite nicely, is the whole notion that, of course, in literary cultural theory has been around for a long, long time, the whole notion of imagined communities, where Benedict Anderson and folks like that linked it to the entire idea of nationhood, that these are imagined communities. I think that same thought is quite a potent thought when I think of my advanced learners in a classroom in German in Washington, D.C., where there isn't much German around anywhere. We are a pure FL environment, and yet I have this crazy idea that I would like for them to be reasonably competent, advanced users of German in this setting. The only way I know how to even theorize this, so to speak, would be to say we need to imagine through the oral and the written texts that I am using as I am teaching you this other community, and that this imagination in and of itself is the negotiation of what kinds of meanings actually occur in these texts. Okay, so here we are, imagined communities that are then not primarily personal, reaction or belief or judgments. What I'm emphasizing here is that so much of what has gone on in teaching and learning would be one listens to an oral presentation, one watches something, one reads a text, and then come the famous, infamous 10 questions afterwards. And what do you think? And what's your reaction to it? And quite frankly, that's not the most important thing. Maybe later on, I want to know what you think. But before you ever get to that, your primary task, or actually my primary task as a teacher, is to entice you, to enable you to imagine what it's like on the other end for these things to be true in some fashion. The things that the oral and the written texts say must be true somewhere in a deep sense, in a deeply value-laden sense. What is it that would entice you to be able to take this important step, both culturally, intellectually, and linguistically? In other words, take the folks on the other end seriously. Don't start out by saying, and I think this is really kind of weird, right? Have you heard that? No, I don't want to hear that it's weird. I want to hear first of what must it be like on the other end for this to make sense for certain people. And that's why multi-perspectival texts, of course, are absolutely critical, because different folks have different strokes, and we need to know that. We need to know that different components of the society have different ways of looking at these things, and it is your task, just like it is my task as an instructor, to find out what that looks like. And then, if all goes well, when we're done at the end, then you might start thinking about it as to how that strikes you. But that's not the most important thing, at least not initially. Okay? Making matters one step more complex. The path chosen as distinct from the path not chosen. What that would mean is, I think, a rather serious rethinking of how we approach language from a theoretical standpoint. We typically, in much of the discussion of grammar, much of the discussion of language teaching, we have foregrounded syntax. We have foregrounded the syntagmatic axis of chain, one thing following after another. The linearity of text, the linearity of speaking, in other words, syntax. Grammar to us has been syntax. That's actually not the most interesting way of looking at it, because coming back to the point of choice, it is the paradigmatic axis that is critical. Choosing one thing over another that could also have been chosen. Because, not the ungrammatical ones, but there are many, many things that often could be said. Why are you choosing this one over the other one? Once more, this, of course, is something that could be done right from the beginning, but for obvious reasons, we don't emphasize it because the learners don't even have the resources. But at the very latest, in early advanced stages, we must make that shift. Yes, your basic syntactic behavior is sort of there, mezzo, mezzo, but I want you to think very carefully why you are choosing to say things this way versus this way, where the syntagmatic axis and the paradigmatic axis, of course, influence each other, right? So the paradigmatic axis of choice has consequences for the way the syntax goes, and in reverse, the syntax has a way of limiting or pushing you or highly likely pitching you towards certain choices that you ought to be making in context. Notice that the enterprise now is becoming much, much more complex. It is pitched towards nuanced behaviors, which is what I am trying to encapsulate in the whole term of choices being made, okay? And those choices are, one more time, different from the way we have portrayed languages in the beginning levels of instruction. They are not rules. They are probabilities, they are typicalities, they are not category memberships. There's all sorts of shifting possible. If it weren't possible, the language wouldn't be able to do what it needs to do. It needs to be able to be highly situated. It needs to be able to reflect a context. So it has to be dynamic, and it has to be topological, sort of like a geography moving from one thing to the other, and relational rather than categorical. This is a major rethinking, particularly since most of our beginning instruction lives under the illusion of rule-based behaviors of categorizations. That's the way textbooks present things. That's the way grammar books present things. That's the way our entire notion of accuracy, fluency, and complexity is pitched, as though that were it. But of course, it never was. It's a convenience that we use. We must get rid of that convenience pretty quickly if we're talking about advanced levels of acquisition. And finally, I would like to then say, again, something that, of course, is true all along, but really comes to the fore now. Choice is an investment of self. You can't just say anything you want to. You must say something, or should be invested enough to be willing to say something that respects the dialogic nature of language use. There is an investment that you make when you say certain things. Toward whom? Toward what? For whom? For what? That brings up notions of responsibility. You can't say anything you want to. It has consequences. Acts of meaning-making make a difference. You have all heard the joke in beginning levels of instruction when learners are told to, in essence, run through the grammatical system and say, okay, tell me, about your family, and the student comes back and, how about your brothers and sisters? And the student says, I don't have any brothers and sisters. And the teachers will say, well, just say so anyway. My brother is such and such. In other words, there is no investment, there is no truth value to any of it. The message is actually seriously off. if language use is deep down about meaning making, then if you don't have any brothers and sisters, it's fine. It's not that I need you to conjugate brothers and sisters and put brothers and sisters into your sentence. So the whole notion of investment in what you're saying, I think, is absolutely critical, because particularly in our multilingual environment, there's a very, very deep ethical dimension to this entire enterprise. And we must make sure that our students, even in a relatively constricted environment of a foreign language classroom, are aware of the fact that you're in this, and you're in this as your whole person, rather than only as somebody that's mouthing something in a language. That's not what this is about. This is a serious affair. Okay, so here we are, summarizing it all one more time. Well, what does it mean? It means in a foreign language classroom that we must provide opportunities, occasions, incentives, whichever way you want to phrase it, for meaning making. Now, once more, this sounds like, okay, what else is new? But if you look more closely at what goes on in so-called advanced courses, very often it does not measure up to this demand. The notion of an advanced grammar course to review things, to me, is pretty far away from what I would see as the need to provide opportunities and occasions for meaning making. So here is perhaps a somewhat provocative notion as to what our classrooms at the advanced levels need to look like. And I would like to look at that in terms of 3 dimensions. We've said it's all about choice, and we could look at this in terms of the ability to make choices, in which case we could call it empowerment, so to speak. We could look at it in terms of the need to make choices, in which case we will shift the notion of need to forms of engagement. And then I would like to add, because that has been very much my experience with advanced learner, is the aesthetic, intellectual desire and delight to make choices. And I would like to call that enjoyment. I think at the advanced level, probably again, much earlier already, unless there is something along those lines in there, why should I stay to begin with? Why should I put myself out like this? Because if there is anything this enterprise is, to use a vernacular, it's a hell of a lot of work. And you have all done it yourself, and I think we need to recognize the motivational aspect of an aesthetic intellectual desire and delight to be the underpinning motivationally for the tremendous amount of work that will be necessary for you to become a really competent advanced user of the language. Lifelong engagement, to put it mildly. So let's look at this real quickly. Ability to make choices. What does it mean? We've already set up a couple of key markers, so I can go relatively quickly on some of those. We've already said that the whole enterprise is about flexibility, deep down. It's about semiotic flexibility, where with the language in and of itself does not exist. It is not graspable, but it is a meaning-making potential. It's a potential that you realize. So deep down, we are asking in an instructed setting for people, it's an astounding notion, to grasp the potential of an entire semiotic system on the basis of relatively limited material. Just think of that, what we're asking people to do. Because in the end, we want them to be able to say their own thing, right? That's possible only if they have a reasonably good sense of the potential of the system and translate the system potential into realized acts of meaning. That's what we want to have happening. So one more time, contrasting it with what we have typically done. This is not, advancedness is not additive. It's not that you've gotten better at the typical things that we have put out, namely more complex, more accurate, and more fluent. CAF, as you look at the applied linguistics literature, of course, complexity, accuracy, and fluency is the mantra. And so advancedness then is typically portrayed as, well, would you please be more complex? Would you please be more accurate? How many times do I need to tell you German adjective endings function like this? We did this in intro 1. Here you are in whatever you are, and you still can't do it. Would you please get better? And would you please get more fluent? No, no, no. Yes, 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 of course I would like all of these things to happen, but that's not the crux of the matter. What I really would like for you to be able to do is to get a sense of the semiotic resources of the language and apply them appropriately in particular contexts. What does that mean? It means that you need to develop an awareness of the lexicogrammatical resources. We're not separating lexicon from grammar. Again, we never should have, but we most certainly can't at the advanced level. There is no way theoretically nor practically to separate lexicon from grammar. It just doesn't work. Never has, and most certainly can't at the advanced level. And we need to be able to develop in our learners a trinocular, three-perspectival way of looking at things. From above, the words in their meanings. From below, the expression plane, whether it is in writing or in speaking, sounding and writing, and from around. Flexibility, this way, this way, this way, where they will all influence each other in order to get at my favorite topic of choice one more time. We need to be aware that it seems to be the case, and there's by now plenty of cross-linguistic evidence available for that. There are two basic forms of human semiosis, of meaning-making. Congruent, where we emphasize the flow of events, because events are not categorized in and of themselves beforehand. We actually do the categorization through the languages that we have. And non-congruent, synoptic. In other words, from the inside or from the outside. And one way of looking at it, as far as language systems are concerned, is the flow of events of everyday oral language typically, and emphasizing the thinginess of the world, as Halliday so nicely phrases it. We can think of it as action and flow. We can think of it as things. And the way it shows up in the languages that most of us teach would be particularly through nominalizations. And those have huge consequences across the entire system because it isn't just a matter of turning verbs into nouns, but it affects the entire textual coherence, foregrounding, backgrounding, theme, rime, hyperthemes. All of those things are directly linked to all of those matters. And underneath it is an understanding that in most cases we have not enabled our learners to get, namely that actually grammar, believe it or not, is the dynamic underneath what works. we tend to emphasize lexicon, and if you look at the SLA literature, you get a lot of talk about, well, yes, and of course your students will tell you, my vocabulary, you know, I need to know many, many more words. Well, of course you do. But deep down, your facility with sophisticated meaning making is not really driven in its deeper understanding by lexicon. It is driven by your nuanced awareness of the capabilities of the grammar of the language that you're studying. Lexicon can then be thought of as a most delicate grammar, and of course where we see it beautifully, coming back to my owls to Athens and my coals to Newcastle, is phraseology, which at the advanced level is this wonderful linkage between lexicon and grammar. It's not one or the other, it's both, right? So phraseology, collocations, sentence stems, metaphors, proverbs, all of those more extended ways of using the language become absolutely central to advanced levels of ability. So I came up with this. You've all heard the terminology of languaging, which is now something that people like a lot. And so I took it one step further and I said, languaging is sort of a dance between phrasing and grammaring. Back and forth, the very thing that I said earlier. We need to be able to this way, this way, this way, in order to have the kind of flexibility that we need. And why is this not moving? Here we are. So we've sort of taken care of it at the bottom. I need to hustle a little bit. Ability to make choices in extended oral and written texts. The central focus of advanced ability levels is textual, where I use it for both oral and written text, and genre-based, because texts in and of themselves are really not teachable. Genre, however, are, because they can be taught as having preferred lexicogrammatical resources, and we can then look at major genre families and push advanced learning in light of those genre families, where the most important ones obviously are narrative genre, explanatory genre, and expository genre. And we would look at those in terms of their typical or probable stages and resources. And if we're going to make sure that our learners are broadly situated at the advanced level, then we would also look at endangered resources. In other words, if we only do certain genre, we're not teaching them other resources. We need to be aware of, if we teach this, we're endangering other things. So it's time for us to look more broadly. And I see a lot of that in curriculum work, where the same thing gets done over and over and over again. Where's the other stuff? Right? Okay. That gets us to a phrase that you've all heard from Dan Slobin's work, which I think is wonderfully apt. What we're trying to create is an ability to think for speaking, which is very different from thinking for writing, which is very different from thinking for listening, which is very different from thinking for reading. Yes, 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 because the lexicogrammatical resources and your processing will be very different in each one of those areas. Okay, it's time for the need to make choices. And I would emphasize one more time that this is a relational need. This is not a rule-based, you need to do X. This is relational in the term of recognizing the other, where the ability to project out this way and this way. You need to be able to look out, and you need to be able to look in. taking the perspective of the other side, where we have all talked about the dialogicality of language as a social fact and responsibility. And one way to think about the push towards advanced learning that I like a lot from the curricular standpoint is that you move from the overt dialogicality of speech and of conversation to the covert dialogicality of writing, of literacy, and the inherent dialogicality of the entire language system. This would be one way of thinking of an entire curricular progression. In other words, dialogicality is everywhere. It is never just a single perspective. And when we have said conversation is dialogical, okay, we haven't said anything particularly unusual, but things get a little bit more interesting when you say writing is equally dialogical. But the dialogicality of writing requires you to have resources that instantiate that dialogicality in very different ways, because writing in and of itself is a monologic enterprise, but its semiotic capacity is dialogical. Wow. What sort of resources do I need to make available to you so that you can create this dialogicality of writing that is absolutely central? That means meta-awareness. And here we have another obstacle to overcome in SLA. SLA has loved to privilege. All you need to do is open any applied linguistics journal, including the Modern Language Journal, of which I am editor. The implicitness. Implicitness is pitched over and over and over again. At the very latest, at the advanced level, it's over with implicitness. I need meta-awareness. I need you to be aware of the relationship between resources and meaning so that you can make intelligent choices. We have dichotomized form and meaning at the lower level, and we have said focus on form and focus on forms. We have sidelined teachers and teaching, because after all, you're not supposed to teach explicit grammar. Well, how about teaching explicitness from meaning? That would be an interesting shift. And teachers then need to have a totally different meta-awareness of language themselves in order to be able to teach explicitly for meaning rather than for grammar. Sophisticated meta-awareness, knowledge of language, both on the part of learners and teachers. We could take it one further. We could then say there's a certain discipline to this. And that discipline gets pitched particularly highly in the disciplines with a capital D. In other words, academic areas of inquiry or professional or institutional environments of using language. What are the centripetal and centrifugal forces, to use Bakhtin one more time, that either bring it together, consolidate it, or let it fly apart? It's both. The dynamic, one more time, is there both ways, and disciplines do exactly that. They discipline you to do certain things. And what is it that is the nature of that discipline that then leads to knowledge creation and knowledge transmission? Because that's what the disciplines do. They use language to discipline the members of the group, so to speak, so that knowledge can be created relatively efficiently and that knowledge can be transmitted. And then different disciplinary areas, using Basil Bernstein's notion, do this differently. The humanities do it differently from the social sciences, do it differently from the natural sciences, and one major way of differentiating that is in terms of horizontal knowledge construction versus vertical knowledge construction. If you're teaching at the very advanced level for professional discourse, that kind of awareness of how a discipline creates its knowledge through language, to me, is absolutely critical. So, making and not being able to make or not making aware choices in times of globalization, mediation, commodification now, of course, complexifies matters even further. And we have such terms as stylizing, translanguaging, performing the self and the other. I won't spend time with that. What we arrive at, however, is what we all love to say and have typically not spent enough time with. There are ways of languaging, there are ways of knowing, ultimately ways of being through language. That doesn't happen overnight, and it also doesn't happen if we continue to have constructs and ways of thinking about language that don't allow for the possibility for this to even be brought to the awareness of our learners. And here we come to desire and delight, the multi-voicedness of the bilingual language user. This is where I think the delight comes in. There's heteroglossia in any language use, but of course it gets really, as one more time Bakhtin says, you can see I am a Bakhtin fan, an avid reader of this, it gets carnivalesque. If you read his Rabelais, it's a carnival that's going on, and that's where the fun is. It is not in the application of rules, it's the carnival that's where it's at. That reflects then identity and self. And the newest work on motivation, if you have looked at what Zoltan Dernier does along those lines, is a very different one than the psycholinguistically driven one, where what this is about is an imagination of an ideal self, an ought-to self, and current and possible future selves that are underneath the whole notion of motivation. Unless, coming back to my earlier comment, I find a way of tapping into your ideal and idealized self, why should you stick with this drudgery? There had better be some fun in there somewhere, okay? And what that will ultimately lead to is, since most of what we do happens to be quite synchronically oriented, it's time to find ways to, of course, again, it should have happened all along, but the emphasis really needs to be there now, synchronic and diachronic. Let's look at what this language has done all along, because many of the things that happened in its development leave traces in its synchronic environment. My coals to Newcastle were an example. Most people wouldn't know what the heck is going on in Newcastle, but there it was. This was an important industrial center, and unless you know that, then all of this becomes an empty phrase. And then we would affirm in these learners, and this is where it gets provocative because it pushes against norms. Affirming the right to use language multilingually is the next thing down the pike. The right to change the system, but alongside a responsibility to sustain it. One more time, a way of pitching the dynamic nature of language while at the same time making sure that any semiotic system can function only if there's a certain core of sharedness, or else it won't work in more than one sense of the world. The joy of being a multilingual advanced language user, I think, needs to be put to the foreground. There's got to be some fun in it somewhere. Concluding thoughts: empowerment, engagement, enjoyment. I am currently having more fun than you can imagine. academic pleasures, with a student who's ready to graduate from Georgetown, who has given himself the name of Gabriel. He's wonderfully apropos to this conference. He's a double major in French and German, started out with French way back when, discovered German at Georgetown, started with Der, Die, and Das in his freshman year, and is absolutely off the charts. In both French and German, I am going to do a longitudinal study of him. I have gathered absolutely everything. I have all of his writing, all of his French writing. I have all of his German writing from the beginning to the end, all of the semester exams, including all the corrections. I am currently getting feedback from all faculty. I have aptitude testing for him. It's all over the map, everything. So this will be my fun for the next couple of years. And in the learner biography questionnaire that I gave him, I asked him, what pleasures, what attractions do you associate with the study of German? You can see this pleasure stuff has sort of been with me for a while. And here's his answer. Unedited, learning, and notice the thoughtfulness, or learning to force myself, with a smirk and a smile in his face, to become a more reflective user of language and of thoughts through language. Parenthetical comment. I think this is imposed to some extent by the grammar and the need to work within boundaries. What a smart way of having come to an understanding of what language does for thinking and being. Then he goes on immediately to freedom. Freedom to creatively frame and think through concepts by way of flexibility. And since we have pounded on them on noun formation, he mentions this in noun formation. Access to the cultural legacy of German-speaking people, possible economic gains way at the end, to be held for knowing German. But it's the first two that I find particularly insightful. So where are we? The advanced multilingual language user is a participant in the continued creation of languages as ever-expanding semiotic resources that are not owned, they're enacted. They're not owned. There is no such thing to own. That's why acquisition isn't the word anymore. But they're engaged with. They're not owned, but they're enjoyed. Where the enjoyment is both cognitive, intellectual, affective, it's individual and social, and it's a reflection of an awareness of the power of limits in the positive sense, of systems, of structures, and at the same time of the power of the liminal, which is the area of freedom. Thank you very much. And after a very harsh winter that you've all heard about, that's actually what the campus looks like right now. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Do we have a minute, or do we need to get everybody into their coffee break?
No, we will make time.
They can get their coffee. Comments, complaints?
We have to use
Oh,
Is it working? Yes. We have to use microphones so that people can hear us also online. So if don't be intimidated, just go to a microphone and have a comment or a question for our guest speaker. Thank you very much.
people can line up and we can be quite efficient about this. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Huguette Bourgeois, and I'm responsible for the advanced professors on campus here. So you can imagine I was very, very pleased with your presentation, especially when you talk about the intellectual delight and desire and aesthetic that you can actually get from these learners who are very high achieving people.
Exactly.
And they just love learning, and also the fact that you do have to let them make choices
Yes.
as to how they will, and I was very, very pleased with your presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that is really at that level the absolute core.
Yes.
As we say sort of flippantly, and I actually say that in class, I can't learn you anything. I can only, hopefully, present opportunities for you, as sociocultural theory says so nicely, Leo Van Leer says so nicely, affordances. Grab those affordances, and the likelihood that you will grab them is if there is some emotional, aesthetic, intellectual linkage to that. I'm a firm believer in the academic environment that there's a quirky relationship and a good relationship between the intellectual and the aesthetic and the enjoyment part of it.
Absolutely.
If that isn't true, I think that would be a problem for us as teachers, and I think it would also be a difficulty for learners.
And I think that's where the gift is, that you give them the joy of learning, but you also have this wonderful joy of teaching.
Yeah,
Because it's, it
So
goes
thanks
around.
for your comments. Yes, I agree with you completely. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I teach ESL, English as a Second Language, and I teach advanced learners exclusively. And I have two questions. One is about pronunciation. You talked a lot about the lexical and grammatical resources and how they should never have been separated from each other, and I agree with you entirely. And I'm wondering why you decided not to mention pronunciation, and is that part of the lexical-grammatical resources, and how important it is for advanced users, because we all know that pronunciation, especially suprasegmentals, work on the grammatical level a lot.
Absolutely.
Plus, they open up space for emotions and many other things that advanced learners can do.
Yes.
So that's my first question. And the second question, it seems like in your talk, you made a point that when we're teaching advanced learners, we seem to be undoing a lot of damage that was
I'm afraid
done.
very often that is the case.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. So I'm just
It
wondering.
shouldn't be that way,
Yes.
but I think in reality it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that probably cancels my question, because for
Yeah.
me, the question would be, shouldn't we reconceptualize language learning generally rather than saying advanced language learners are different? Because you can definitely teach beginners that when they say something with wrong pragmatic choices, there will be consequences.
Right. You're singing my theme song, which is exactly why we embarked on our complete curricular revamping. I said, if at this institution, in this program in German, we have this illusion of creating in this short period of time, in a less commonly taught language, which is what German is in the US, pretty competent multilingual users of German, we need to rethink the entire curriculum. And as you know, in the US, and I think it's true in many countries, not just in the US, there's this complete break between the first 2 years of language instruction that is essentially communicatively oriented, and then come the content courses in literature, in language for specific purposes, blah, blah, blah. A complete chasm between the two. And I think it is that break, that chasm, that has actually created the glass ceiling that we have encountered in language acquisition. I'm a firm believer in the fact that instructed learners can do much, much more than we ever allowed for precisely because we created this completely dichotomous environment between the grammar and rule-based approach in the first 4 semesters, that's a typical 3 or 2, shrinking all the time in the US, and then the content learning. We need to rethink that enterprise right from the beginning, which was exactly what we ended up doing by saying, out with the textbooks, out with all of this stuff, let's rethink the entire enterprise and make it an integrated 4-year curriculum. And we couldn't be happier with it. And we couldn't be more pleased with the results, because these learners are, in fact, able to accomplish remarkable language acquisition in a relatively short period of time. Coming to your pronunciation question, I couldn't agree with you more, and that would actually exemplify the very point. Unless that is done right from the beginning, because it is the pronunciation, the suprasegmentals, the performativity of it, that is actually the pragmatics already for the entire enterprise. It's not just the printed stuff. It is the use of language to foreground, to background, to pitch, to cajole, to enjoy, to make fun of, all of these things that is expressed through voice and performativity. And unless that is done in the beginning, they won't get it. And the pronunciation aspect, I say that to our graduate students that do, they teach throughout the program, but particularly at the beginning, you must be very attentive to the fact that it is your voicing, your projection of the whole thing that brings this enterprise to life. Coming back to Gabriel, and then I'll finish the answer. He happens to be a completely instructed learner of German who, as I am now finding out through all the aptitude testing I'm giving, even all the way to the high lab test of the government, cajoled them into it, give me that test too. I need to have very sophisticated tools for this very sharp kid. Extraordinarily acoustically oriented. So an aptitude for rhythm. And this is the terminology he uses. He said, the rhythm of the language. He does, and then he says, I took French because it's a beautiful language. Have you heard this before? And then he goes to German and he says, and the rhythm is very different because the rhythm of German pitches itself to the qualities of German as a grammar. And that, to him, is picked up with all the antenna of somebody that listens. So there you have it. You are completely correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. And do we need them all to get their cup of coffee? I think we do.
Yes, I need to move to a microphone
Yes.
to say once again, thank you very much for a very interesting, thoughtful presentation, and we will have discussions about complexity. I think that this concept has to be rethought in terms of paradigmatic choices rather than syntagmatic chains. And on that note, big round of applause. Thank you very much, and we'll go to coffee.